She was told to kneel. In front of 40 guests, crystal glasses, and a marble floor worth more than most people's homes, a bride pointed at a woman in a plain gray uniform and said the word kneel, like she was talking to a dog. What that bride didn't know is that the woman standing in front of her had once walked into a burning embassy and walked out carrying 2 ambassadors on her back. She didn't know that the same steady hands now holding a wine bottle had once disarmed a man twice her size in under 2 seconds. And she certainly didn't know that in less than 10 minutes, every single person at that table would owe their life to the help. This is the story of Naomi Reyes. And by the time it's over, you'll never look at the quiet person in the corner of the room the same way again. Let's rewind 6 hours. The Whitfield estate sat on a bluff above the Atlantic, 40 minutes north of Newport, Rhode Island. It was the kind of house that didn't need a name because everyone who mattered already knew it. 9 bedrooms. A private dock. A wine cellar older than most of the guests combined. The kind of place where the gardeners made more in a season than most families made in a year, and still felt lucky to work there. Tonight, the house was lit up like a lighthouse, because tonight was the rehearsal dinner for Grant Whitfield and his bride-to-be, Camille Duval. Grant was 34, heir to a shipping fortune that stretched back 4 generations, quiet in the way that wealthy men who never had to prove anything are quiet. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold. He was just absent in the way people become when life has never once told them no. Camille was different. Camille had grown up the daughter of a French luxury goods magnate, and from the time she could walk, she had been taught one lesson above all others. Some people matter and some people exist to serve the people who matter. She was beautiful in the polished, expensive way that photographs well and feels like nothing when you're standing next to it. And she had never, not once in 29 years, learned another person's name if that person's job was to be invisible. Which brings us to Naomi. Naomi Reyes had worked at the Whitfield estate for 16 months. She was 36 years old, 5'8", with dark hair always pulled back tight and a posture that made her look taller than she was. She moved through rooms the way experienced nurses move through hospitals, quietly, efficiently, without ever seeming to hurry, and somehow always exactly where she needed to be a half second before she was needed. The other staff liked her, but they didn't know much about her. She didn't talk about her past. She didn't post on social media. She had one framed photo in her small room above the garage, of herself standing next to an older man in front of a building that no longer exists, and she never explained who he was. What none of the household staff knew, what none of the wedding guests filing into the dining room that evening knew, was that 8 years earlier Naomi Reyes had a different name. A name that appeared in exactly 4 government documents, 3 of which are still classified. For 9 years she had worked as an executive protection specialist for people whose deaths would have started wars. She had been trained to notice an exit route within 3 seconds of entering any room. She had been trained to read a stranger's intentions from the way their shoulders moved. She had been trained, above all else, to become furniture, to disappear into a room so completely that danger would walk right past her without ever knowing she was the most lethal person in it. She had left that life 5 years ago, after a job in Marseille that she still didn't talk about, even to herself. She had made herself a promise on the flight home that night. No more weapons, no more missions, no more rooms where the wrong decision meant somebody's family got a folded flag instead of a father. She wanted quiet. She wanted invisible. She wanted a life where the worst thing that could happen to her was a broken wine glass. She got a job in hospitality instead. Nobody at any of her interviews ever asked why a woman with her skill set, calm under pressure, unshakable memory, flawless attention to detail, wanted to fold napkins for a living. Nobody thought to ask. That was, in a strange way, exactly what she was counting on. 2 guests at that rehearsal dinner, however, did ask. Silently and only to themselves. The first was Walter Kessler, 70, Grant's godfather and a man who had spent 3 decades in defense consulting doing work he still couldn't discuss at Thanksgiving. Walter had been watching Naomi from his seat near the head of the table since the appetizers were served. Something about the way she stood, weight balanced, shoulders relaxed but never soft, eyes doing a slow sweep of the room every 90 seconds like clockwork, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd seen that stance before. He just couldn't place where. The second was Dr. Adiz Nwosu, a trauma surgeon who had flown in from Atlanta as a +1, someone Grant had once met at a fundraiser years earlier. Dr. Nwosu had spent 2 years working with a humanitarian medical team in conflict zones most people couldn't find on a map. She knew what it looked like when someone was trained to be ready for violence at any moment. And she was almost certain she was looking at exactly that, standing 4 feet away, holding a tray of champagne flutes. Neither of them said a word. Not yet. The evening had started smoothly enough. 9 courses, a harpist in the corner, candlelight bouncing off $200,000 worth of table settings. But somewhere around the fourth course, Camille's mood started to shift, the way it always did after her third glass of wine. It started small. She snapped her fingers at Naomi to refill her water. She complained, loudly enough for the table to hear, that the bread basket had been placed at the wrong angle. She corrected Naomi's pronunciation of a French wine, even though Naomi had said it correctly, simply because correcting the help in front of guests made Camille feel, for a moment, like the most important person in the room. By the seventh course, the table had gone quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something building but nobody wants to be the one to name it. Grant kept his eyes on his plate. Walter kept his eyes on Naomi. And Dr. Nwosu had stopped eating entirely, watching the way Naomi's expression never once cracked, never once shifted, no matter what was thrown at her. And then Camille stood up. She'd been telling a story, something about a charity gala she'd chaired, though several guests at the table quietly knew she'd only shown up for the photos. And mid-sentence she turned, looked directly at Naomi, and said the words that would end her engagement, humiliate her family name for a decade, and very nearly get every single person in that room killed. Naomi, sweetheart, maybe you should go back to wherever you came from. I'm sure they need cleaning ladies more than we do. 40 Forks stopped in midair. Nobody breathed. Grant's face went white. Walter set down his glass so slowly it barely made a sound. And across the table, Dr. Nwosu watched something pass behind Naomi's eyes. Not anger, not hurt, but a kind of stillness that felt, to a woman who had spent years around trauma, unmistakably familiar. It was the stillness of someone who had trained themselves a long time ago, not to react to cruelty. It was armor. And for the first time all evening, Dr. Nwosu wondered what it would take to crack it. Camille wasn't finished. She pointed at a small drop of red wine on the marble floor, one Naomi had already wiped up twice, and said loud enough for the whole room, "Clean it. On your knees. Now." The silence that followed had weight to it. You could feel it pressing on the room. Naomi looked down at the floor. And then, for the first time that evening, she looked up. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't wounded. They were calm in a way that made the hair rise on Walter's arms, because he'd seen that particular calm exactly once before in his life, 22 years earlier, in a hallway in Beirut, on the face of a woman who had just made the decision to end 3 men's careers in under a minute. Before Naomi could answer, before Camille could say another word, the side door off the kitchen corridor slammed open. 4 men in dark clothing moved into the hallway in a tight, practiced formation. Weapons already raised. No shouting, no demands, the quiet, efficient movement of people who had rehearsed this exact routine more than once. They'd been hired by a rival shipping executive who had lost a 9-figure contract to the Whitfield family 2 years earlier and had spent every day since plotting exactly how to make them pay. He'd studied the guard rotation. He'd studied the guest list. He'd studied the household staff roster and crossed off every name except one he considered a threat. Grant Whitfield himself, a man who, according to the intelligence he'd paid for, hadn't thrown a punch since prep school. Nobody had told him about the woman refilling the water glasses. Chaos erupted instantly. Someone screamed. Chairs toppled. Grant grabbed Camille and shoved her behind a stone column. Walter's hand went for a weapon he hadn't carried in over a decade, and to his own surprise, his fingers remembered exactly where it used to sit. The lead gunman reached the dining room threshold and raised his rifle toward the crowd. He never got the shot off. Naomi moved, not fast in the way action movies show speed but fast in the way water moves, without wasted motion, without sound. In under 6 seconds she crossed the room, redirected the barrel of the rifle toward the ceiling, and had the weapon out of his hands before he understood what had happened. A second gunman fired wildly, the bullet shattering a wall sconce above the table. Naomi was no longer standing where she'd been half a second earlier. She was behind him, using his own strap to bring him down to the marble floor without so much as a grunt. A third man turned to run. He made it 4 steps. 11 seconds after the door had burst open, all 4 intruders were on the ground, disarmed, restrained, conscious, and staring up at a woman in a plain gray uniform who hadn't raised her voice once. Nobody in that dining room moved for a long moment. The only sound was the soft dripping of spilled champagne off the edge of the table. Dr. Nwosu was the first to speak. She walked toward Naomi slowly, the way you'd approach someone who had just walked out of surgery. "It's you," she said quietly. "I read your file in Sudan. They told us you were dead." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. "I asked them to say that," she said. Walter finally exhaled, a long breath he seemed to have been holding for 20 years. "I knew it," he said. "The stance. I never forget the stance. Camille, still crouched behind the column, mascara streaked down her face, looked up at Naomi with an expression nobody at that table had ever seen her wear before. Something raw. Something human. What are you?" she whispered. Naomi looked down at her, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the silent room. "My name is Naomi Reyes. Before that, I had a different name, one I can't tell you, attached to work I'm not allowed to talk about. For 9 years, I kept people alive who couldn't afford to die. Diplomats, witnesses, people whose names you'd recognize if I could say them. I disarmed men exactly like the ones on your floor more times than I can count. And then 5 years ago I walked away from all of it because I wanted a quiet life. A life where nobody's survival depended on my next decision." She glanced down at the intruders, then back at Camille. "I poured your wine tonight. I folded your napkins. I let you humiliate me in front of 40 people because I decided a long time ago that this, quiet, ordinary, invisible, was the life I wanted instead of the one I used to have." She paused. "That ended tonight. Not because I wanted it to. Because the moment those men came through that door, the only choice left was to let this room die, or to be who I used to be one more time. I chose this room." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And then, slowly, the venture capitalist 2 seats down from Camille stood, walked across the room, and did something none of them expected. He bowed, not for show but the way you bow to someone who just saved your life. His wife followed. Then Walter. Then the caterers who'd been frozen by the kitchen door. One by one, every person in that room crossed the floor and stood in front of Naomi, heads lowered, until even Camille, still on her knees, still trembling, whispered the only honest word she'd spoken all night. "I'm sorry." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and walked out through the kitchen into the cold Atlantic air, the way she'd arrived 16 months earlier, without telling anyone where she was going. Grant caught up to her at the gate. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Somewhere I can keep my promise a little longer," she said. He didn't ask to come. He understood, somehow, that this wasn't his story to follow. In the weeks that followed, the 4 attackers gave up the name of the man who'd hired them within hours of questioning. He was arrested before sunrise the next day, having never once suspected that the household staff at the estate he'd targeted included someone with 9 years of field experience he couldn't have imagined in his worst planning session. Grant broke off the engagement 2 weeks later. Camille's name showed up in a few gossip columns over the following year, attached to smaller and smaller headlines, until it faded out entirely. Proof, if anyone needed it, that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one whose name people remember for the right reasons. And Naomi Reyes, wherever she went next, carried on doing what she'd always done best. Showing up quietly, doing the work nobody noticed, and reminding anyone paying close enough attention that real strength has never needed an audience. Here's the truth this story leaves behind. The person everyone overlooks in a room, the one refilling the water, holding the door, standing quietly in the corner, is very often carrying more strength, more history, and more resilience than anyone bothered to imagine. Respect isn't something you extend only to people who look powerful. It's something every person earns simply by being human, simply by showing up and doing their work with quiet dignity, day after day, whether or not anyone ever says thank you. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you were at that table, would you have even noticed her, before everything changed? Tell us what you would have done in the comments below. And if this story moved you, take a second to like it, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the strongest one in it. Thank you for watching. And remember, you never really know the whole story of the person standing quietly beside you.